What's the creepiest display of intelligence you have seen? Let's dive in. Story 1. A friend once showed me a notebook he had made about his girlfriend. He had tracked all sorts of things, her likes and dislikes, what gifts he gave her, and exactly how she reacted. He even figured out which of his actions led to what responses, and what phrases he could use to get a specific reaction. Using all this, he wrote a little manual of sorts, outlining predicted outcomes for different scenarios. For example, if she got upset, he had strategies ready to calm her down so he could get back to doing what he wanted. It was somewhere between sweet and unsettling, less creepy than it was a bit disturbing. Story 2. My biological grandfather was either deeply disturbed or extremely manipulative. He was smart, charming, and very successful, but he did some things my family doesn't talk about. When I was 2, he tried to offer my dad money to buy me because my mom had cut contact with him long before. Yes, really, he tried to purchase me. I don't remember the exact figure, but it was somewhere around $300,000 with monthly support. I'd have to ask my parents for the exact details. Story 3. There was a guy I used to know who barely spoke around new people and only answered questions when asked. At first, I thought he was just shy, but I later realized he was extremely observant. He once said, "I don't like her, she's too smart and pretends not to be. I don't trust people like that." Turns out, he used to be manipulative himself and admitted it. He read people constantly, who to trust, who dated who, even their mannerisms. He would say things like he's seeking approval, probably had a tough childhood. He once described my stepmother, someone he'd never met, with eerie accuracy based on a few things I said. It was like he saw straight through people. Story 4. I once knew someone who could remember absolutely everything he ever read. But he didn't like to tell people about it because it would become a game. People would challenge him with trivia or test his memory. He stayed quiet and less provoked. But if someone made him angry, he'd suddenly recall things in perfect detail, like something you texted 7 years ago, and quote it word for word. He was kind and quiet, but the way he remembered everything was intense. Last I heard, he was no longer in touch with anyone. I hope he's doing okay. Story 5. Right before my ex-wife and I separated, she admitted something terrifying. She said she had purposely isolated me from my friends and family over the years, not out of anger, but so that if she ever decided to kill me, she'd have time to hide the body before anyone noticed I was gone. At the time, I hadn't spoken to loved ones in over a year, so no one would have known. We've been divorced for 3 years now. I have full custody of our 3 daughters, and she's currently in a mental health facility. I didn't know during our relationship, but she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia 2 years before our divorce. I don't blame her entirely. She was kind when we met, but her mental health deteriorated after each child was born. Story 6. As a criminologist, I've studied many people with psychopathic tendencies. A lot of them are highly intelligent and remarkably skilled at reading others. One case that stands out involved a serial offender in New York. He could determine whether someone was likely to report him based on a few minutes of conversation. He analyzed their voice, facial expressions, choice of words, clothes, makeup, and even their accent. It wasn't instinct. He had studied these things intensely with the specific goal of finding vulnerable people. His level of understanding of others' minds was unsettling. Story 7. I once went on a date with a guy I'd just met. We walked a bit, then sat down at a nice restaurant. After a couple of drinks, he started analyzing me. He pointed out that I wore a specific pair of shoes to match my shirt, that I picked the location to show off my car, and even that I'd subtly checked his posture while we were walking. He said I probably chose the table in the corner because I was reserved. Most of what he said was accurate. He was a psychiatrist, and it felt like he was using some kind of superpower. I didn't go on a second date, but I still remember how odd it felt being read like that. Story 8. I've met some shady characters over the years, but one really stood out. He was a serious addict, yet also extremely knowledgeable in chemistry. His house had various compounds he claimed to have made himself, and they were all real. He explained how he made each one, and it all checked out. It was eye-opening. I've learned not to underestimate anyone, especially not those at their lowest. He was clearly brilliant in certain areas, just making harmful choices. Story 9. I visited a friend with a drug issue once, and there was another guy there who was incredibly intelligent. He talked about chemistry in ways I couldn't even follow, and showed me photos of substances he had synthesized himself. Despite having been to jail for it, he still worked a high-paying tech job, reportedly making around $40,000 a month. Chemistry was just a hobby to him. He was kind and soft-spoken, but he'd been robbed at gunpoint and had to move multiple times because people were seeking his homemade substances. He planned to move to the middle of nowhere so he could work remotely and continue his experiments in peace. It was both impressive and concerning. Story 10. When I was 16, my stepdad discovered that my mom was cheating on him. This was in 1992, so he secretly bugged the home phones, landlines back then, and recorded conversations in the garage. I spent a lot of time talking to friends on the phone, so he had to listen through hours of my teen chatter just to catch bits of my mom's calls. He even put a tracker on her car so he could follow her from a distance. Looking back, it was quite an impressive setup for the time. Later, he told me I should probably get a job so I wouldn't spend all day on the phone. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Story 11. I knew a girl who went to therapy and managed to convince 3 different therapists that she had 3 entirely different diagnoses. One believed she had dissociative identity disorder, another said she showed signs of psychopathy, and a third diagnosed her with bipolar II. In reality, she didn't have any of those conditions. She was simply incredibly smart, bored, and curious. She'd read extensively about each disorder and tested whether she could trick professionals into believing her. After the 3rd misdiagnosis, her main therapist stopped seeing her. She was later diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. She'd graduated high school at 14, finished college by 18, spoke 4 languages, and created her own comics. Now she's studying to become a veterinarian. Story 12. I used to run a pub crawl in Eastern Europe. We hired a guy who had been living on the streets. He was heavily tattooed, even had a split tongue and face tattoos. I later found out he had a serious issue with drugs, likely meth-related. Surprisingly, he became essential to the team. He knew every bar, every staff member, and everyone seemed to like him. We were supposed to get 1 free drink per bar, but he managed to get us full bottles instead. It was impressive, but also hard to manage. He manipulated people so subtly, strengthening his own role by making everyone rely on him, while quietly disrupting the system. Watching him operate was like witnessing a master strategist at work. Story 13. I watched my mother build up trust with my little sister for weeks, validating her feelings and being supportive, only to use that closeness to start feeding her false stories about our father and older sister. There was no real purpose other than to stir up insecurity and resentment. My mom has been diagnosed with multiple things: borderline personality disorder, OCD, PTSD, and anemia. But to me, it just feels like emotional manipulation without direction. She's intelligent in some ways, but seems to lack true understanding of how to connect with people in a healthy way. Story 14. In high school, there was this guy who was incredibly smart. He could do complex math without even studying and never seemed to struggle academically. But he was also deeply manipulative and involved in a lot of drama, especially of a strange nature involving classmates. His father was apparently very similar, and I think he had some serious parental issues. He honestly gave off the vibe of someone who might lack empathy. Last I heard, he had a nickname that made me uncomfortable, and he was still involved in odd behavior well into adulthood. It honestly unsettled me. Story 15. My late friend Bruce had this ability to learn absolutely anything: languages, history, tech, whatever he set his mind to. After years of organizing sci-fi conventions, he decided to become a Cisco Certified Internetwork Expert, CCIE, one of the hardest certifications in IT. Most people take years, pay thousands, and go through rigorous steps to earn it. Bruce, however, bought some used books, earned multiple certifications along the way, and became a certified instructor in under a year. He passed the final CCIE exam on his 2nd try, 18 months from knowing nothing about networking. Companies paid top dollar for him, even just to list his name on their team. His life was full of stories like that. He was truly one of a kind. Story 16. About 10 years ago, I worked at a psychiatric hospital, floating between units wherever extra staff were needed. For a few days, I was assigned to the adolescent unit. There was a 12-year-old boy, let's call him Joe, who had been transferred from another residential center. At that previous facility, he had led a group of young boys who assaulted girls there. Joe had memorized the staff schedules, knew who was strict and who was lax, and would plan everything around that. He had no remorse and seemed to find satisfaction in causing harm. He frightened me, not just because of his actions, but because of how calculated and aware he was. A search of his room revealed hidden staff schedules. To this day, I wonder where he is and what path he's taken. He was the only patient who genuinely scared me. Story 17. My aunt worked as a psychiatric nurse for nearly 3 decades. Toward the end of her career, she moved to a hospital near a military base and took a position in an adolescent unit. She once cared for a 9-year-old girl who truly unsettled her. The girl didn't speak much, but she frequently mentioned how she wanted to go home to see Woody, and that she was upset she had left him dirty. Eventually, my aunt asked who Woody was. The girl calmly explained that Woody was her wooden bat, hidden in the woods behind her house, which she used to hurt neighborhood pets. Before being admitted, she had harmed a dog and left blood on the bat. That was 10 years ago, and my aunt still brings her up. Story 18. Once, at a casual get-together, I was chatting with people when a guy I'd never met approached me and said, "You're a musician, aren't you?" I told him I played guitar, and he replied, "I thought so. Your fingers are calloused in a way that only comes from string instruments. They've toughened evenly, which means it's been a long time since you stopped playing. And your posture, it's typical of someone who spent years hunched over while playing." He said it all so casually, like it was normal to read people that deeply. I hadn't been holding my hands in any noticeable way, so I was shocked. I quickly made an excuse to leave, but I kept wondering what else he had noticed about me without saying it. Story 19. My nephews and I were playing in the basement. 2 of them started arguing over a toy, and I separated them. A few minutes later, the 4-year-old leaned casually against the wall near the light switch, turned off the lights, ran over, punched his older brother in the face, then flipped the lights back on and acted like nothing happened. When I confronted him, he simply said, "It was dark. You didn't see me do it." I was a little unsettled by how calculated the whole thing was, premeditated and sneaky at just 4 years old. Story 20. I've driven a garbage truck in my town for about 5 years. My routes are loaded onto a tablet, which shows customer names and addresses, around 5,000 houses in a week. My mind gets bored even with audiobooks or podcasts, so I start noticing names and the cars in people's driveways. Over time, I remember whose house is whose, and I start recognizing people around town. I've accidentally creeped people out because I'll strike up a conversation, remember their name, and ask something like, "Is that your car?" Or, "Do you live in neighborhood?" Not with bad intent, but because I'm observant and used to work in sales. My wife told me to dial it back, and now I mostly keep to myself when we're out. Story 21. My 6-year-old daughter sometimes says, or does things that completely catch us off guard. She has a sweet little voice and acts like she can't do anything for herself, but sometimes I wonder if she does that intentionally. Once, my son was struggling to read a sentence, and she glanced at it and read it out loud perfectly, then denied she had done it. When she was 4, we were trying to sort out cars for a family outing, and while the adults were overthinking everything, she immediately figured out how many people would fit in each car. And she was right. We speak Italian at home sometimes, and I assumed the kids didn't understand. But one day my mom was talking in Italian about getting them bikes for Christmas. My daughter gasped and looked excited, then quickly acted like nothing had happened. She later denied understanding anything. Her basic math is better than mine. Granted, I have dyscalculia, and she seems to grasp things quickly, she just hides it. I worry she might think being smart gets her in trouble, so she pretends not to know things. I hope that's not the case. Story 22. A friend of mine had just come out of a terribly abusive marriage when she started seeing a guy from work. Unfortunately, he turned out to be married with a young child. He strung her along emotionally and financially, slowly wearing her down. That's when a mutual friend from university stepped in. She told our friend exactly how to respond to his behavior, what to say, what tone to use, and everything she predicted came true. She crafted responses that were designed to turn the tables psychologically. Within 48 hours, this man, who had previously seemed so in control, had gone absent from work and was later found in the hospital after trying to harm himself. Our mutual friend had never even met him, but she had read him so accurately that it was almost scary. I still wonder if she just had a gift for understanding people, or if it was something darker. Story 23. My ex, Ely, once accessed 7 different computers using our neighbor's shared Wi-Fi. He made it look like the disturbing content he was viewing had never been on his own device. At the time, we were living in a duplex and using their Wi-Fi with permission. One day, I walked in and found him doing something strange on his computer. It showed a network map with all the connected devices in the building. When I confronted him, he denied everything and convinced me I had misunderstood. Years later, I found an image on a shared tablet. It was clearly taken in our very recognizable bathroom and showed my 14-year-old niece in an inappropriate situation. I called the police immediately. Ely never came home again. He's now in prison. That night, I realized his Gmail was still logged into another device, and I watched his search history update in real time. It included searches like what happens when you're convicted of this, and how to get your wife back. I'm grateful I found out what he had done before he hurt anyone else. My daughter still struggles, but I feel incredibly lucky to be the one raising her. Story 24. I worked at a psychiatric hospital years ago. One of the most disturbing patients I came across was a 12-year-old boy named Joe, who had been the leader of a group of boys at a residential center. He planned and coordinated serious assaults based on his detailed knowledge of staff routines. He knew who paid attention and who didn't, and timed everything perfectly. What was frightening wasn't just what he had done, but how intelligent and strategic he was. He was calm, friendly, even charming, and clearly enjoyed watching others suffer. We found printed copies of staff schedules hidden in his room. I've never forgotten him. Story 25. My aunt spent nearly 30 years as a psychiatric nurse, and the one patient who genuinely unnerved her was a quiet 9-year-old girl. The girl had been transferred between several hospitals because her family kept relocating. She rarely spoke, but she frequently mentioned being upset she had left Woody dirty. After a couple of weeks, my aunt asked who Woody was. The girl explained that Woody was her wooden bat, which she kept hidden in the woods near her home and used to harm animals. Before her latest hospital stay, she had killed a neighborhood dog with it and hadn't cleaned it off. That was a decade ago, and my aunt still brings her up whenever someone asks about the most troubling case she ever handled. Story 26. I once worked with a guy who noticed everything: subtle hairstyle changes, someone switching brands of water, a jacket worn on the wrong day. He'd never ask questions, but somehow knew everyone's business. I asked how, and he said, patterns are louder than words. One time, he told me a coworker was having marital issues. 2 days later, she filed for divorce. He didn't gossip, just observed and stored things mentally. It wasn't malicious. He genuinely thought everyone should pay attention like him. Being around him felt like being in a constant behavioral experiment. I often wondered what conclusions he drew about me. Story 27. In college, I had a classmate who could predict with eerie accuracy who would drop a course. By the second lecture, he'd say things like, "She's gone by week 3, or he won't survive midterms." He watched how people engaged with the professor, took notes, or even where they sat. Once, he claimed the guy who doodled in the margins would ace the final. He did. When I asked how he knew, he said, "People show you their commitment long before they speak it." It was unsettling, like he saw a future you hadn't yet written. He never got a prediction wrong. Story 28. I once dated someone who could detect every small lie I told, even harmless ones. If I said I was fine, she'd tilt her head and calmly respond, "You're frustrated. Your voice tightens when you lie." She read facial expressions like novels, spotting tension, blink patterns, even slight shifts in posture. Once, I lied about why I didn't answer a text, and she listed the real reason back to me step by step. She didn't get angry, she just knew. I wasn't hiding anything serious, but her ability to see through me made me paranoid. Eventually, I stopped lying. Eventually, I stopped talking. Story 29. My brother used to test people, quietly, methodically. He'd leave a $20 bill on the floor and see if friends returned it. He'd tell white lies to see if someone would correct him. He called it trust calibration, like it was a science. He even ranked people in a notebook, noting how they reacted to different scenarios. At first, I laughed it off. But then I realized he was doing it to everyone, including me. One day I asked, "Do I pass?" He just smiled and walked away. I've never really known what he thinks of me, and that's what unsettles me. Story 30. There was a guy in my old neighborhood who knew everything, without ever asking. He could tell when someone lost a job just by the time they took their trash out. He knew which couple was fighting before they knew it themselves. He once told me I was about to move, even though I hadn't decided yet. "You changed your running route," he said. "Means you're disconnecting." And he was right. He watched patterns, lawn care, car usage, delivery frequency. Not in a creepy way, just aware. I started wondering how much people unintentionally broadcast. Around him, I felt completely transparent. Story 31. My college roommate had a strange talent. He could tell when someone was about to cry, even before they realized it. Once mid-conversation, he looked at a friend and said, "Let's step outside." She hadn't shed a tear yet, but the moment we got outside, she broke down. He claimed he could see it in their breathing, the tightness around their eyes, even how they held their shoulders. He wasn't a therapist or an empath, just extremely observant. He'd pick up on things no one else noticed. Honestly, it was comforting at times, but also a little unsettling. Like he could see everything. Story 32. There was a barista at a coffee shop I used to visit who could guess your order before you spoke. He didn't rely on memory, he read people. Large oat milk latte, 2 pumps hazelnut? He asked a stranger once. She blinked and asked if he'd served her before. He hadn't. He said he used context clues, shoes, time of day, mood, how they scanned the menu. It wasn't a trick, it was analysis. I once tested him by changing my usual order, and he still guessed right. It felt like he'd scanned my soul. He should have been in intelligence, not espresso. Story 33. I went on a single date with a man who read me like a novel. Within 20 minutes, he said, "You park far from places because you don't like being boxed in. You wear blue when you're feeling unsure of yourself." I laughed nervously. Both were true. Then he said, "You hesitated on your drink order because you're afraid of seeming predictable." He was right again. It was fascinating and uncomfortable. I left that date knowing I'd never see him again. It wasn't that he was rude, it's that he saw too much too quickly. I felt like I had no privacy. Story 34. My coworker once created a spreadsheet ranking everyone in the office, not by performance, but by how trustworthy they were. He kept it hidden, but I found it open one night while locking up. There were notes beside each name. Gossips when nervous, favors those who compliment him, never lies even under pressure. It was like a psychological dossier. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said, "You don't go into battle without knowing your team." I couldn't tell if he was joking or not. I still think about that list sometimes and wonder what mine said. He deleted it the next day. Story 35. There was a kid in my class who never spoke unless spoken to, but he noticed everything. Once, he told our teacher that another student was cheating on tests. When asked how he knew, he said, "He only taps his pencil when he's copying. Otherwise, he doesn't." He was right. No one had picked up on it. Over time, I realized he tracked everyone, where they sat, how they reacted to feedback, how often they blinked when nervous. He wasn't creepy, just sharp. One day, he turned to me and said, "You're not really happy here, are you?" I never answered. He already knew. Story 36. My friend's younger brother used to set up social experiments at family events, for fun. At age 10, he'd subtly move furniture to see who'd notice. At 12, he started switching sugar and salt in labeled containers to test reactions. Once, he put tape under the dining chairs to hear who'd fidget the most. His mom thought it was harmless curiosity, but I wasn't so sure. By 14, he claimed he could tell if someone was lying by how they held their silverware. He wrote in a notebook, rating everyone's predictability. I once asked if I was on the list. He looked up, smiled, and said, "Everyone is." That was the last time I underestimated him. Story 37. A guy I worked with never asked direct questions, yet somehow always knew the answers. He'd walk by your desk and say, "Rough weekend," before you'd even opened your mouth. If you got a haircut, he'd comment on it before you stepped into the building. One time, I joked that he must have cameras installed. He just said, "People are patterns. You only need to pay attention." At first, it felt like intuition, but eventually it became clear. He was studying all of us. Our habits, moods, even how fast we typed. He never used the knowledge maliciously, but it made me hyper-aware of myself when he was nearby. Like I was always under a microscope. Story 38. I went on 2 dates with a woman who could analyze me better than my therapist. She'd say things like, "You smile too much when you're nervous," or "You paused before saying your brother's name. Something happened between you two?" Her questions were never invasive, just observant. She said she'd been practicing cold reading since middle school. What freaked me out wasn't just that she was right, it was that she enjoyed being right. Every conversation felt like I was being gently dissected. On the second date, she told me I'd never call again. I asked why. She said, "Because you value privacy more than connection." I still don't know if that was insight or suggestion, but I never called. Story 39. There was a man who used to visit my dad's repair shop every Tuesday. Polite, quiet, always in a crisp suit. One day, my dad mentioned that a customer had stopped coming in. Without hesitation, the man said, "He's going through a divorce," started carpooling with his neighbor to avoid driving past her work. My dad stared, speechless. "How do you know that?" he asked. The man shrugged. He stopped coming in on Thursdays, stopped wearing his wedding ring, and started picking up the local paper instead of his usual tabloid. The signs were there. He paid for his oil change and left. My dad still tells that story. No one ever found out what the man did for work, but we're pretty sure it wasn't just accounting. Story 40. My cousin used to play this unnerving game at parties. He'd walk up to strangers, spend 30 seconds observing them, then say something shockingly personal. You're a youngest child. You don't like group photos. You just got over a breakup. 9 times out of 10, he was right. People thought he was psychic, but he admitted he just read microexpressions, body posture, and language patterns. He studied books on interrogation techniques and behavioral psychology for fun. At first, it was impressive, but eventually, he made people uncomfortable. You never felt truly relaxed around him because you knew, even without asking, he already knew everything he wanted to about you. Story 41. My old landlord was an older man, polite but strangely insightful. He'd fix things around the property himself and make little comments like, "You've been sleeping less, everything okay at work?" I never told him anything personal, yet he knew when I got a raise, when I was fighting with my partner, even when I was considering moving out. I eventually asked how he always seemed to know. He said, "People's patterns are louder than their words. You start leaving at different times, shutting your windows instead of leaving them open, using more water in the evenings. It tells a story." I stopped feeling at home after that. It was like I'd unknowingly starred in a show where he was the audience, taking notes the whole time. Story 42. I used to nanny for a 6-year-old girl who was frighteningly smart. She'd pretend not to know basic things like how to tie her shoes, just so adults would do it for her. But I once caught her reading chapter books way beyond her age level and doing math quietly in her notebook that I couldn't even explain. One day, I asked her why she always acted like she couldn't do things, and she said, "Because when you act small, people don't expect much. It's easier." I didn't know how to respond. She was 6. I stopped underestimating her after that. Story 43. A woman in my book club rarely spoke, but always asked the most piercing questions. She once asked someone, "Why do you always defend the antagonist?" It threw him off. He didn't realize he'd been doing it. Later, he admitted he saw himself in the villain. She could make people uncomfortable without raising her voice. She'd notice inconsistencies in stories, call out subtle hypocrisies, and bring conversations to dead silence with a single sentence. She claimed she'd studied debate for fun in college. I don't think she meant to intimidate people. It just came naturally. You didn't talk loosely around her. She heard everything you didn't say. Story 44. My boss once told me I needed to stop hesitating before lying. I hadn't realized I did. He explained, "Your eyes flick left, you hold your breath, and your voice softens a touch." He wasn't angry, he was amused. "You're terrible at lying, which makes you good to keep around." It was the most unsettling compliment I'd ever received. He remembered everything, dates, offhand remarks, even tone shifts during phone calls. One time, he recalled a conversation we'd had a year ago word for word. He wasn't threatening, but you always felt like he had an archive of every move you'd made. Working for him felt like being under constant, silent surveillance. Story 45. There was a kid in my high school who rarely spoke, but when he did, it was like he'd been collecting data for months. During a group presentation, he suddenly corrected a teacher on a fact, quoting a page number, author, and publication year. He wasn't being rude, he was just precise. He remembered everyone's locker combinations, birthdays, even their routines. Once, he handed me a forgotten umbrella and said, "You leave it every time it rains on Tuesdays." I'd never noticed. He wasn't popular, but everyone respected him, part curiosity, part fear. I always wondered what he remembered about me. I never asked. Story 46. My coworker once said he could tell who had grown up poor just by how they handled napkins. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he went on. "People who've had to ration things fold napkins carefully, reuse them. Others crumple and toss them without thought." Over lunch one day, he casually pointed out who grew up in what kind of household based on how they ate, how fast, what they left behind. He wasn't smug, just observant. Later, I realized he wasn't wrong. It was strange, unsettling even, to realize how much of your past you carry in the smallest habits. He noticed everything, without even looking like he was paying attention. Story 47. A girl in my dorm used to sit in the common room quietly knitting, never engaging unless someone spoke to her first. One day, during a conversation about breakups, she chimed in, He doesn't text you back because you talk about your goals. He doesn't want to compete. It stopped everyone mid-sentence. She barely knew us, but every time she spoke, it was like she'd been listening with surgical precision. She knew people's fears, insecurities, and motives without ever being told. She once said she wanted to be a screenwriter because, I already write people in my head. Might as well get paid for it. Honestly, I believe she could. Story 48. My aunt dated a man who was charming, funny, and made everyone feel heard, but I never trusted him. He'd say things like, "You're the kind of person who'd rather suffer silently than admit you're overwhelmed." And he'd be spot on. He always made it sound comforting, like he understood you, but there was something performative about it. He would compliment strangers in ways that seemed personal, intimate, too accurate. One night, I heard him say to my aunt, "I know how to be the version of myself people fall for." That gave me chills. He wasn't lying. He really did become who people wanted. But I don't think anyone ever got to meet the real him. Story 49. At a previous job, there was an older woman in accounting who people often overlooked. She was quiet, wore modest cardigans, kept to herself. One day during lunch, she said, "Your manager is trying to get rid of you, by the way. Not because of performance, because you remind him of his sister." I stared at her, stunned. Turns out, she'd overheard snippets of hallway conversations, watched how meetings shifted, how emails changed tone. She had mapped the office politics like a chessboard. "People tell you who they are," she said, "if you know how to listen sideways." She retired a year later, and to this day, I still wonder how much she knew that no one else did. Story 50. A guy I once volunteered with could predict people's emotional states after a 5-minute conversation. "He's grieving, but not for someone who died, something else," he said about one man. Turns out, the guy had just lost his job of 20 years. He'd pick up on micro changes in speech cadence, eye direction, even whether someone crossed their arms inward or outward. Outward means guarding. Inward means hiding, he explained. He wasn't a psychologist, he worked in tech. But he said learning to read people was just another system. Watching him was like seeing someone speak a language most of us didn't know existed. He didn't judge people. He decoded them. Story 51. My former professor once told me he could tell which students were going to cheat before the first exam. He based it on where they sat, how they looked around during lectures, and who they gravitated toward in group discussions. He once said, "Desperation hides in quiet corners and polite smiles." At first, I thought he was being cynical, but his predictions turned out to be accurate every semester. He kept a mental log of tendencies, who turned in late assignments with perfect grammar, who over-explained easy answers. He didn't report anyone. "My job isn't to catch them," he said, "just to understand them." Being in his class felt like sitting across from someone who knew your secrets before you spoke. You couldn't fake anything around him. Story 52. I knew a girl who could make you feel like the only person in the world. She'd mirror your mannerisms just slightly, lean in when you leaned in, repeat your phrasing subtly. It wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it, but it made her incredibly likable. She had friends everywhere, people confided in her within minutes. One night at a party, I asked her how she did it. She smiled and said, "People love seeing themselves in someone else." That stuck with me. Over time, I realized she wasn't connecting, she was reflecting. You never really knew her. Just yourself, smiling back. Story 53. My cousin used to be in security for a casino. He once told me they could spot card counters by the rhythm of their breathing. "It changes when they're doing mental math," he said. But he didn't just stop at cheaters. He'd point out relationships forming across the room, people planning to steal chips, even someone trying to hide a bad beat. He said emotions interrupt patterns, and pattern breaks are where truth hides. He watched with a blank expression, but missed nothing. He could sit for hours and walk away knowing more about a room than someone who had mingled all night. Sometimes I forgot he was watching me too. Story 54. There was a substitute teacher in high school that everyone thought was odd. He barely spoke, didn't smile, and graded with ruthless precision. But he noticed everything. Once, he asked a girl if she was okay because she wore her hair tied lower than usual. "That usually means you're tired or don't want attention," he said. Another time, he told someone they were trying too hard to sound smart, and they admitted they were. No one liked being around him for long, because it felt like he could see through all your defenses. I only saw him twice, but I still remember his stare. Not cold, just knowing. Story 55. I had a neighbor who always knew when someone was about to move out, even before the signs. Too many Amazon boxes. Getting rid of stuff. That's a pre-move purge, he once said. Another time, he correctly guessed a couple down the street had broken up just because one of them stopped bringing in both trash cans. He said people's routines scream change when they don't mean to. He wasn't nosy, he never asked personal questions. But he'd sit on his porch like it was a control tower, observing small shifts most people never notice. When we finally moved, he didn't say goodbye. Just nodded. He'd known long before we did. Story 56. A guy I went to grad school with never studied during group sessions, but always aced the exams. We thought he was just naturally gifted until one day he said, "I just watch how people answer practice questions. I can tell what's important based on what confuses them." He had memorized not the material, but our mistakes. He would track which chapters caused the most hesitation, which diagrams people flipped to most often, and use that to reverse engineer what would be tested. It was brilliant but unnerving. He once told me, "Why read the book when I can read the readers?" I didn't study near him again after that. Story 57. I dated someone who always made people feel like they were being heard, but over time, I realized she never actually revealed anything about herself. She'd ask deep, thoughtful questions, always respond with a smile, but you could never quite pin her down. When I asked her once why she never talked about herself, she said, "I've learned people stay longer if they think they're the ones being understood." It wasn't cruel, just calculated. When we broke up, she didn't fight it. She already knew I would. She saw it coming long before I did, and that somehow hurt more than the goodbye. Story 58. At a summer job, I worked with a teenager who could imitate anyone, voice, walk, even texting style. He once sent a prank message from someone's phone, and their best friend didn't realize it wasn't them. He said he practiced by watching people's posture and timing, even the way they held their phones. He wasn't trying to cause harm, he just wanted to see if he could do it. But one day, he mimicked me so perfectly it felt like a violation. He knew what I'd say before I said it. He laughed, but I didn't. It made me realize how easy it is to be impersonated when you think you're being authentic. Story 59. My grandfather used to play chess with strangers in the park. He always won, but it wasn't because he was a chess master. He read people, not just boards. He'd say, "They lean forward when they're bluffing an aggressive move," or "They play fast when they want to scare you." He had strategies for different personalities, overthinkers, show-offs, the nervous. It wasn't about the game. It was about the player. Once, he said, "Everyone brings their real self to the board eventually." Watching him play was like watching a psychologist in action. Even when he lost, he'd grin and say, "Now I know how they tick." Story 60. I had a coworker who would always guess people's passwords. Not in a malicious way, he did it as a party trick with permission. He'd ask a few casual questions like your favorite movie, pet's name, or high school mascot, then guess a variation with creepy accuracy. People protect their accounts with memories, he said, and most people share their memories too easily. It made me realize how much we reveal in small talk. He once told me my password was probably tied to something I loved before I was proud of it. I changed all my passwords that night. He never misused the information, but I still felt exposed. Story 61. A woman in my therapy group never talked about herself, but everything she said to others felt like she had lived their exact experience. She once looked at a man and said, "You're angry at your mom, but pretending it's about your job." He burst into tears. She'd catch people's habits, their apologies, avoidance, sarcasm, and gently point out the truths behind them. Eventually, someone asked her how she knew so much. She smiled and said, "I just paid attention when no one paid attention to me." It wasn't condescending, just honest. The scary part? She was never wrong. Every insight hit exactly where it hurt or healed. You left those sessions thinking she'd read a journal you hadn't even written yet. Story 62. I worked retail with a guy who could immediately tell if a customer was going to cause trouble. He'd glance at someone walking in and whisper, "They're going to argue over the return policy." Or, "She's here to steal. She's wearing shoes too big, easy to hide tags." He was right almost every time. When I asked how, he shrugged and said, "Stress looks different when it walks in the door." He wasn't judging people, just noticing what others missed. One time, I asked what I looked like when I came into work. He said, "Like you're pretending this job is temporary." I still don't know if that was observation or prophecy. Story 63. In college, there was a guy in my dorm who always seemed to know people's secrets. He wasn't nosy, he just listened too well. One night at a party, he turned to a girl and said, You hide your depression behind being the fun friend. She froze. They'd never spoken before. He told another guy he only dated people who needed fixing. It was like he was holding up mirrors people had been avoiding. When I asked how he figured these things out, he said, "People write confessions with their habits. I just learned how to read the punctuation." That line still echoes in my head. Story 64. There was a woman in my office who always knew when people were lying in meetings. She never called them out directly, but she'd ask just the right follow-up question to make them stumble. "Can you remind me when you sent that email?" Or, "That timeline seems fast. Can you walk us through it again?" Everyone learned quickly. If she asked you to repeat something, it meant she already knew the truth. Her calm demeanor only made it more intimidating. One day I asked if she'd studied psychology. She laughed and said, "No, I just got tired of being lied to growing up." It made sense. Story 65. My best friend's little sister once watched a family argument silently, then said something that shut everyone up. "You're mad at Mom, but you're yelling at Dad because he's easier." She was 9. No one had told her anything about what was going on. She just watched. Later, I asked her how she knew. She said, "People say one thing but look another way when they're lying." Dad wasn't lying. She was right. Her honesty wasn't cruel, it was surgical. She didn't mean to be manipulative. She just didn't yet understand how powerful she was. That kind of clarity in a child? It's both beautiful and terrifying.